congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And you are now with us for Conversations Over Coffee. Today's guest is Ambassador Daniel Shapiro, who served as the U.S. ambassador to Israel under President Barack Obama from 2011 into the end of the Obama administration. Before that, he played a role with National Security Advisory in the Obama White House, and now is a commentator and a member of think tank in Israel as it relates to foreign policy issues in the Middle East and so forth. I also feel blessed that I can call Dan amongst one of the people with whom I am friends. I want to thank you, Ambassador, for being here.
Great pleasure.
Let's jump right in, because I know you've been extremely busy lately with certainly the Democratic Party and U.S. politics as it relates to Israel, and never a dull moment. Never, ever a dull moment. I know that one of the things that's on people's minds, certainly people who've been watching Vice President Biden for his career know what a good friend to Israel he is. And historically, the people that he put around him when he was in the White House and certainly when he was in the Senate have all been, people that are known to us in the Jewish community and have been following these kinds of politics for a long time. Nevertheless, now that he has achieved the nomination of the party today seems very different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago when he first began his quest to become president of the United States. And there's a lot of concern in the Jewish community and the pro-Israel community, both in the US and in Canada, and probably in Jewish communities around the world. What's the impact of the new wave of Democratic leaders that are certainly more progressive and ensconced in a more progressive left that others would call the quote unquote radical left? What's the impact that's having on the party and especially on the platform as Vice President Biden looks to the general election?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be with you, and we are good friends, and with your congregation. So, obviously I was asked this question a lot during the primaries, whether the Democratic Party and is it becoming a much more progressive kind of institution? Sorry. Hang on, I'm moving to a different room.
These are the challenges that we all have between the boundaries of work, home, and school.
My apologies. Okay, this will be easier. So I asked this question a lot during the Democratic primaries. Whether the party, is it Joe Biden's party? Is it Bernie Sanders' party? Is it a more progressive party? What does it mean for Israel? And, obviously, different candidates express themselves somewhat differently on these questions during the primary. Vice President Biden adhered to his career-long positions, absolute unstinting support for Israel, for its security, for U.S. military assistance to Israel, to defending Israel from any attack on its legitimacy, whether it's in the United Nations or whether it's in the BDS movement at home. He called the proposals for conditionality of aid to Israel a gigantic mistake and outrageous. He was very clear. He was who he was. And then, of course, he won the primary. And so I found it a little bit strange that after that, a lot of people were still asking me, well, yes, but, what does the party think? I said, well, look, all I can conclude from that is that the significant majority of the voters who chose him as their candidate either agreed with him on those issues strongly, or at least it wasn't, a reason to vote against him. They may have other issues they prioritized. So I think that the rumors of the party's complete reorientation on Israel are very overstated. There are some new voices for sure. It's a big tent, and there are definitely progressive members who articulate themselves on different ways on this issue. And there's two members of Congress, maybe there will be a third next time, who have expressed support for the BDS movement. The vast majority of Democrats serving in office supported resolutions last year in the House of Representatives that were very Biden-esque. Support for Israel's security, for the MOU that I helped negotiate at the end of the Obama administration for $38 billion to defend Israel against any attack on its legitimacy, including BDS, to support two states and active U.S. involvement in that effort. That's where 95 or more percent of the members of the House of Representatives are. I think the vast majority of the senators are in a similar place. And so, of course, that included, by the way, maybe we'll get into this, opposing annexation of the West Bank while that was on the table. It seems, fortunately, to be off the table for now. But those were the positions that I think really had critical mass support in the party. So they really lined up very much with what Vice President Biden has discussed. And by the way, I don't speak for the campaign. I try to help the campaign, but I'm not an official representative of the campaign. But then when it came time to go to do the party platform, and I was a member of the platform committee appointed by the party chair, Tom Perez, we tried, as one does in a platform, to be unifying. There were task forces that invited members of the Sanders and the Warren campaigns into the drafting process, notably not on foreign policy, and mostly on domestic issues. But even on foreign policy, there was some informal discussion to try to make sure their views were at least taken into account and where possible reflected. But it had to be a platform that also reflected the views of the nominee. And so when all was said and done, if one reads the Israel-Palestine, let's say, section of the party platform, it sounds like Joe Biden. It's unstinting support for Israel's security, for the MOU, for Israel's qualitative military edge, for defending Israel from all attacks on its legitimacy, foreign and domestic, and strong support for two states, holding both parties to the account and not having them do the unilateral steps, annexation or incitement, that make that harder to achieve. And so it says to me that those are still, very strongly supported positions across much of the vast majority of the party. I think there is a lot of polling that demonstrates that. There are definitely, as I said, some new and loud voices. There were a few people who weren't so happy that that's what the platform said, but I think the significant majority across a very wide swath said, that sounds right. That sounds like something we are basically all in 90% agreement on, and it certainly sounds like our nominee. It sounds like Joe Biden. So I was happy with the outcome of that platform, and I've mostly heard good responses from people in the pro-Israel community who are in the party.
What do we know about Kamala Harris and her approach to Israel and to the Middle East?
It's very similar. It really lines up perfectly with Vice President Biden's. That's like just one of those issues that was not a non-issue for them. Nothing they had to reconcile. She, of course, doesn't have the decades-long involvement that he does as a state official and the last 3 or 4 years in the Senate. She has traveled to Israel. I've met with her in Israel. I've met with her in her office in Washington to brief her. She's been an attendee at AIPAC. She just actually spoke on a fundraiser that the Jewish community organized for her, 1,800 people online, and raised a significant chunk of money for the campaign. And she said things that sounded also like Joe Biden, but these were things she said her whole career. Absolutely unshakable support for U.S. assistance, for Israel's security, for standing up to attacks on its legitimacy, and for two states. So I think, there's no issue there, and her nomination has also been very much welcomed by many people in the pro-Israel parts of the Democratic Party.
And yet still, it's like, you look at the rise of Bernie Sanders over the last 2 elections and his base, which is a lot of young people that seem to not understand all the nuances, shall we say, of the Middle East. And as young people are apt to do, God bless them, right? With a very passionate commitment to a sense of justice and equality. When they look at the Middle East and American involvement, the Netanyahu government and so forth, they find it disappointing. Even centrists sometimes can look at that and find it disappointing. But yet with the rise of Bernie Sanders and what seems to be a very vocal new left of the Democratic Party, how worried should people who find themselves more towards the middle be about what happens next? You're muted, Dana.
Sorry. There's room for discussion and debate within the party across a wide range of views on lots of issues. Again, I haven't seen it reflected in vast majority shifts either in polling or in the views of representatives. Of course, that could change generationally, but even among young people, you don't see a vast change. There are there was a lot of focus, obviously, on a couple of members who expressed very different views and even endorsed BDS back in this earlier part of this Congress. But the members who actually swung districts from red to blue, from Republican to Democratic district and swing districts in Midwestern states and in some southern states and Western states, generally were really moderates. They on this issue and on many other issues, and they really don't have that flavor. So while it is true that perhaps in certain very progressive districts you might hear some of these new attitudes, you're not seeing them reflected in critical mass, especially in those districts where it actually is necessary for Democrats to win to get a majority. And even in some progressive districts, there's a young man named Richie Torres from the Bronx in New York City. He's a 31-year-old African-American, Puerto Rican, LGBT, I think city councilman, now won the Democratic primary in his district. Looks like he'll be the nominee. I mean, he's, in some ways out of central casting for progressive politics, given all of the various aspects of his biography and many of his views. And he is a staunchly staunch supporter of Israel. He's traveled to Israel. He can make the progressive case for Israel, certainly for two states. But he is, he waves that flag, and he's rejected those on the far left who have, sort of held up a litmus test. Anybody who travels to Israel or anybody who expresses support for Israel is somehow unfaithful to broader progressive principles. He just utterly rejects it. So having that voice now getting a national profile, I think, matters. Look, in the platform, you do see, I think, there is some new language. There's a discussion of two states being something that would achieve, obviously, Israel's right to security and legitimacy and joint and recognition, but also Palestinian rights, legitimate rights to self-determination. Obviously, there are things they have to do to get there, but that question of rights is new. We do call out in the platform annexation. Didn't put it on the table, obviously, but had to address it by saying what virtually every Democratic office holder agrees on, that annexation would be very detrimental to two states. Talked about settlement expansion for the first time. So look, there are some other there have had some influence in the discussion and the debate. But at the end of the day, has the policy shifted in some unrecognizable way that should make people who are strong supporters of Israel uncomfortable? I don't think so, and I wouldn't be able to be active in a party or with a nominee that was the case. So I feel very confident about that.
Let's talk for a moment about Iran. One of the things that a Biden presidency is sure to do is to try to bring back the Iran agreement. Let's imagine for a minute if that were to be possible. First, of course, Biden has to win the presidency. Are there any lessons that he's learned, that his advisors had learned, that they would seek to apply if they wanted to reopen that agreement?
Well, again, not speaking for the campaign, I'll make a couple observations. First of all, the bottom line for the vice president certainly is that Iran can never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. That's just a bottom line. It's unacceptable. It's too dangerous, this regime. We know how it calls for Israel's destruction. We know how it sponsors terrorist organizations. We know how it seeks to dominate and interfere with its neighbors. And that's an absolute principle. What he has said about the nuclear deal itself, or the platform says, and he said some slightly different formulations, is that, you know, if Iran were to be returned to compliance with that deal, the United States would try to would plan to return to compliance with that deal, and then begin a process to negotiate a longer term deal. Now that is a very big if. It's hardly a guarantee that Iran could even get back into compliance. After the Trump administration withdrew from the deal in 2018, Iran began to push the envelope on enriching levels of uranium above what was permitted, on reinstalling some centrifuges, on doing other things that the deal does not permit. They have allowed the inspections the deal requires to continue, but in other ways they've cheated. So it's very possible that if Biden is elected, by the time he takes office, the deal will have fully collapsed. The current administration is sort of in a process at the UN Security Council now, trying to push for snapback of sanctions, which may be the last straw on the camel's back, and the deal may collapse. Two lessons, I guess, maybe go in opposite directions. One is that, you know, while there's certainly legitimate room for criticism or for saying, you know, the deal that was signed in 2015, you know, could have been stronger, could have had more years before certain provisions sunsetted. It could have, you know, placed even tougher restrictions on certain technologies, although it really did remove from Iran's hands for a very significant period of time the necessary technologies and raw materials to build a nuclear weapon. It could have had even tougher inspection protocols, although they were quite tough. It could have applied to ballistic missiles, which it didn't address. It's certainly possible to do that, but you know what it did do was it bought time. It did push the Iran nuclear deal, which at the time the negotiations were taking place, they were at about 2 months from the ability to produce a nuclear weapon. And by removing those raw materials and technologies from their hands, pushed them out to at least a year, and had means to keep them at that distance for at least 10 to 15 years. Now that's not perfect, and certainly doesn't solve the problem forever, if that's possible, but it bought a lot of time. But it was always intended that that would be the platform for negotiations for a longer term deal that would add more time and more restrictions and additional inspections and the like. So the intention has always been to build on that diplomatic success to get even greater restrictions. But to do so, one needs to have the international community with the United States, and that's where there's a strong difference from how the Trump administration has handled this. By pulling out of the deal, a deal the United States was party to, it basically let Iran off the hook. Iran now cheats on the deal. And now that the United States, now that Iran is much closer than 1 year, they're about 6 months or probably less than 6 months to being able to get a nuclear weapon, we don't have the world with us. Well, we have the Israelis and the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates with us. And that's, you know, not insignificant, but we don't have the Europeans, we don't have the Russians, we don't have the Chinese. We cannot have the entire world help us in this diplomatic effort, both the pressure part and the negotiations part, when we have unilaterally pulled away from it. We saw this at the United Nations last week, 2 weeks ago, when the administration tried to get the arms embargo at the UN arms embargo that will expire in October extended. Everybody wants the arms embargo extended. Nobody wants Iran to be able to buy and sell weapons. But the administration had so alienated everyone else on the UN Security Council that we got one vote with us and 13 countries not with us. And now we're trying to do the snapback of sanctions, which is going to fail because other countries will not observe. They said, wait, the United States withdrew from the deal. They don't have the standing to put the sanctions back in place. So that lesson is keep your allies and your partners together so that you have a united front to put those necessary pressures and enter those negotiations with Iran. The last piece, though, is one has to say the Trump administration's unilateral sanctions, we call them secondary sanctions, really sanctions on other countries or the companies in other countries, if they do business in Iran, have been more effective than many people expected. I have to acknowledge that the Iranian economy has been put in a very deep hole by these sanctions. And that shows that the United States can do maybe more on our own sanctions-wise if we need to, if Iran doesn't abide by agreements. But it also means that we have the ability in a real negotiation where we have partners to take some of those off. Because if we were going to get real longer restraints and broader restraints on the nuclear program to give us even greater confidence for even greater number of years, that Iran could never have a nuclear weapon. We're going to have to give something. And so we'll have to take off some of the sanctions, but we do it knowing that if necessary, we can reimpose them and have a real effect.
When, one of the complaints that I heard when the deal was being negotiated against President Obama was that there wasn't enough teeth to it. That Dennis Ross, for example, who was one of the early architects of the deal until the switch was made between Hillary Clinton to John Kerry, he pointed out like 4 or 5 different things that the U.S. could do, even on its own, that would have strengthened the deal. And that one of the concerns that people had was that although the president, on the one hand, I remember, was the most vocal against Iran during his leadership, especially in the early parts of his administration. But on the other hand, people didn't really have confidence that he would go all the way if needed in order to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of the Iranians. How might Biden view that, or how might Biden navigate that sense of, on the one hand, the declaration of no nuclear weapons in Iran, a desire, of course, first and foremost, for effective diplomacy with the types of sanctions and other kinds of tools that might provide some teeth. But like at the end of the day, Iran could be unpredictable, or maybe they might be predictable even. To what extent, would a Biden administration really truly have all options on the table, including a military one?
Well, that was definitely the policy of the Obama administration. I'll say that. That Iran will never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon. We'll use sanctions, we'll use diplomacy, we'll use negotiations. Those are the preferred tools. By the way, that was all something we agreed with Israel on through many years of consultations with them. But that we also need to have a military option. Because as a last resort, we have to be able to prevent it. And indeed, when President Obama took office, we didn't really have a military option. And he directed our military to put one in place by deploying the necessary forces in the appropriate places in the Middle East, by developing specific weapons to target specific Iranian facilities underground that otherwise we did not have an ability to reach. I remember when we shared the results of that effort with our Israeli colleagues, and they were impressed. And that exists to this day. Also a whole array of missile defense architecture across the Middle East to defend our allies if Iran were to respond. So we have a military option. We have one because the Obama administration put it in place. It didn't inherit one. The Trump administration has it. It's interesting. Trump rarely makes that threat, and Trump has made clear, in his own way, that he's not looking to start more wars in the Middle East. But I think when the Biden campaign, or when the vice president says Iran will never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon, I don't know yet if as a presidential candidate it's necessary to start talking about military options. Obviously, he doesn't have any at his disposal as a candidate. But that principle certainly strongly implies to me that that option remains on the table. One thing I have to say about Trump is that, he thinks of himself as a real deal maker. And so he's put on this maximum pressure and these sanctions. I said it's had the benefit and the deficit that I described. It's really put some serious pressure on the Iranians. It has caused them to cheat on the deal and now are closer to nuclear. It has cost us support from others. But, he said just a few weeks ago, he said, if I'm reelected, Iran will strike a deal in 4 weeks. They will beg for a deal. Now, I think we know from what we've seen about how he's handled some other deals. You're sitting in Canada, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement is a good example of that.
After 2.0.
Yeah. His greatest deal of all time is like a little bit more than anything Obama did. And certainly he hasn't shown yet, and he didn't show it in the North Korea negotiations, that he has the ability, hasn't shown it with China either, that he has the ability to really stick with it, to dig into the details, to maximize, to use the pressure maybe he has actually generated to get the actual benefits of what his efforts may have given him the opportunity to get. Rather, he's much more likely to do a sales job to say, oh yeah, I got a great deal, but it's not really that much different a deal. We always understood, and Biden has been clear on this, that the JCPOA, even if the United States returns to it in a Biden administration, or if it can't be returned to because it's basically dead and we skip over that stage, was really only step one of what has to be a long-term sustained diplomatic effort with as many partners as possible to keep Iran's feet to the fire and make sure that through all of these different tools that we have, they know they will never have a nuclear weapon, and we will ensure that.
Let's turn to Israel for a few moments, for the moments that are remaining. We talked for a moment, like, for the first time, at least publicly, in my recollection, Prime Minister put full-blown annexation of the West Bank on the table, which certainly at the time at which that happened would have signaled probably the end of any realistic two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. To what extent do you think that was real versus internal politics, internal Israeli politics, UEA, negotiating this deal now that kind of seems to take that off? I mean, basically, what do you think is going on in Israel right now?
Well, I think it started as a mostly internal political thing. You recall that the prime minister, who I worked with a lot, in my years as ambassador, and I, respect and all of his achievements, he had never been for annexation. In fact, he used to tell me and my colleagues about how he would be the one arguing against annexation to his colleagues in the Likud party and explaining why that would be so dangerous to Israel's Jewish and democratic character. So I always understood he was more of a status quo person. He did endorse a two-state solution in the Bar Ilan speech in 2009. He kind of backed off it in 2015, but that he wasn't looking to make permanent, Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank beyond maybe very small adjustments. Then that changed a week before the first of the three Israeli elections in April 2019. Now, don't want to be too cynical about it, but when a politician changes a long-standing view right before an election, I don't know, maybe the election is something.
It's hard not to be cynical about it.
Hard not to be. So they've started at that, and then he doubled down and tripled down on that in the second and third elections. And along the way, the Trump plan emerged in January of this year, which more or less gave a green light to annexation. Kind of a green light, and then they sort of shifted it to a yellow light because of an internal dispute within the administration. But the plan is not a two-state solution plan. Trump finally used the term two states for the first time when he issued that plan. But if you look at the map it describes and the entity, that's the Palestinian entity, it's a disconnected series of islands of very limited autonomy.
It's what Netanyahu would have wanted.
It's not anything you would call a state, and no Palestinian leader would ever negotiate on that basis. So it had no real chance of being implemented as a plan. The only thing that it could do was facilitate unilateral annexation of the parts designated for Israel, up to 30% of the West Bank. And then Netanyahu got very kind of up ahead of steam. He wanted to do it. He got a stop sign from Jared Kushner, who thought, no, wait a minute, we want to recruit some Arab state support for this plan. And if they just rush out and annex, that's not going to happen. We should let this election happen. We should let him form a government after the election. So it was all kind of on pause, but it seemed to me, because the prime minister had negotiated into the coalition agreement that he signed with Benny Gantz, that of all issues in this power sharing agreement, that was annexation was the only issue he had the power to bring to the cabinet by himself without Gantz's approval after July 1st. And even if it had started as kind of an internal political thing, and then even if it had been, sort of nudged forward unintentionally, perhaps in some way by the Trump plan, I think he was quite serious about it. Having promised it so many times, it seemed serious. And by the way, you're right. It would have been absolutely the end of a two-state solution. There's no way very unlikely you could come back from that. It was strongly objected to by quite a number of Israeli leaders, not in the right-wing parties, certainly by the Palestinians, by Jordan, that he could have threatened the peace treaty with Jordan, by other Arab states, by Europeans, by every Democratic Party politician. Biden and 90% of Democratic senators and members of the House signed letters, and the ones who didn't agree against annexation. So Israel had to bear in mind that, well, if we annex now in the last 3 months before an American election, and then there's a party switch in Washington, that recognition might go away.
That's one of the things that surprised me most about it. It's like it just seems so foolish in terms of, any kind of long-term relationship, even with the US.
Well, it was, and that's why it's among the reasons very fortunate it didn't happen. But the off ramp was not obvious, and what happened, if you recall, in about mid-June, so a couple of weeks before Netanyahu first had his opening of his window to bring it, the UAE ambassador in Washington, Yusuf Olotai, who I know well, published an article in Yediot Ahronot, the largest Israeli newspaper, in Hebrew, unprecedented for an Arab official to address the Israeli people that way. And it was very respectful. It wasn't kind of a harsh thing. It said, look, we in the UAE think we see an opening for much better relations with Israel and opportunities and technology and trade and tourism. And we welcome Israel to the region. But you Israelis just need to understand that normalization is incompatible with annexation. And since both are on the table, you shouldn't have to know. You have to choose. You got to have one or the other. You can't have, it's not going to be both. And it really shaped the conversation in Israel for quite a number of days after that. And then it led to a negotiation or a conversation between the UAE and the White House. And eventually the Israelis were brought into that. And the question was then put on the table, if annexation is taken fully off the table, is full normalization, not some halfway measure, in the cards. And that was the deal that was struck. Now, for political reasons, Netanyahu said, well, I suspended annexation, or I still want to do it with U.S. concurrence. There's no chance they're going to embarrass the UAE leadership after they have really stuck their necks out this way. The Trump administration is not going to give them approval for annexation, and certainly a Biden administration wouldn't. So annexation is really off the table. And that's the second good thing that came out of this deal. I mean, the UAE normalizing with Israel is terrific news. I have only good things to say about it. Today was the first flight from Tel Aviv to Abu Dhabi.
Over Saudi Arabia.
Over Saudi Arabia is a reason to celebrate. This has been a long-term strategic objective of administrations of both parties to gain more Arab normalization with Israel, not contingent on the Palestinian issue. That was what the Arabs said. Well, it's a peace initiative, first two states, then normalization. It was never a U.S. position. So this is all good news. And it comes with even better news, which is that it pushed annexation off the table, which helps keep a two-state solution alive. I think the assignment for a Biden administration would be, that's great. How do you continue to expand the circle of peace, get more Arab states to take this step, and then build on that as a basis to get Arab states who sit with Israelis in that formal, normalized way, as Egypt and Jordan have for a few decades, to together work toward a real two-state solution. The Palestinians are going to have to make some big changes to get there. They're going to have to get off the sidelines for sure. I think creative and determined diplomacy has a chance of building on this very good outcome to help achieve another very good outcome. That's really important for Israel's Jewish and democratic character.
Can the Palestinians get off the sideline? I mean, they seem to be on it for so long. As Abba Eben said, they really seem to have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Obviously there have been a lot of ups and downs in the negotiations, a lot of staying out of negotiations, and then of course there's the issues, the positions that will just ultimately have to change maybe at the end of a negotiation, but nevertheless recognizing Israel's Jewish state. There's not going to be a right of return of Palestinian refugees to pre-67 Israel's security needs, and of course the illegitimacy of violence, which unfortunately even the PA has too often given sanction to.
And they're building up their own infrastructure in a way that creates a viable political entity.
Yeah, I don't think President Abbas is going to be the Palestinian leader who is going to make those hard decisions, tell those hard truths to his own people, take the risk, and it might be a risk for him to get off the sidelines. Certainly there's no trust at all between Abbas and Netanyahu. So that pairing is almost unworkable. I know that firsthand. I think, well, look, there is a transition coming. He's in his mid-80s. Arguably, it may be harder for the next Palestinian leader to be more flexible than Abbas. But on the other hand, there is a younger generation of Palestinians who sees that their leadership has not really delivered for them. One way you could go is even a harder line, and even more, doubling down on the doctrine that says we'll never, compromise on any of historic Palestine. And the other way is say, well, look, is there a path, and maybe with some of these other Arab states as partners and supporters, economic supporters, political supporters, and other ways helping build infrastructure, helping displace Hamas from Gaza, that we can actually achieve, at least the core of what we want, the self-determination and a state of our own, a viable state of our own in the West Bank and Gaza, at peace with Israel. Is it hard? For sure. Can I identify who those Palestinian leaders are after Abbas, who I feel confident can do that? Not with confidence. But I think that, just because the current leadership, I'd say on both sides are, situated so that they really are not candidates to make these decisions together and build the necessary trust. That doesn't mean that the next leaders are not. I mean, one lesson from this region is that leaders can surprise the world and even surprise themselves. Menachem Begin, when he was elected in 1977, was considered the hardliner of hardliners of Israeli politics. He was never going to return the Sinai to Egypt that had fought 2 wars against Israel in the past decade. Sadat was the enemy number 1 in Israel, who would have, tried to drive the Jews into the sea. And within a matter of months, almost like no time flat in historical terms, these 2 leaders tested the waters, recalculated their interests, took some risks, built some trust, not perfect trust, but enough, had an American president, Carter, who was able to accompany them on this journey and utterly surprised the world. And I think there's a lot of evidence to surprise themselves about how far they went. So is that possible with new leaders? It is absolutely possible. We've seen it. Is it difficult? Is it hard to predict? For sure. But that would certainly be an assignment for a Biden administration to try to identify leaders that it can work with to take those kinds of risks, build that trust, and maybe surprise the world.
Well, that sounds like a good place to conclude this conversation. We're entering, we're in the month of Elul, and we're entering the period of High Holy Days. And one of the lessons of Rosh Hashanah, in which we celebrate Hayom Harat Olam, the beginning of the world, is that every year, really every day, every moment, we have the opportunity to surprise ourselves. And to surprise our communities, and to renew the world, and to renew ourselves, and to make it a little bit better. And so thank you, Ambassador Dan, for joining me for 35 minutes or so about these really important issues that are on everybody's minds around the world. Because what happens in the US at this next election it really does have global impact. Maybe we'll get you on afterwards for like a follow-up as well.
I'll either be smiling or crying, but I'll be happy to talk either way.
Yeah, right. Hang on for 1 second. So let me just say that next week we'll be taking a bye week. It's Labor Day, both in the US and in Canada. Of course, in Canada, we spell it with a U. So it's a little bit longer, I suppose, as a result of that. But we'll be taking the day off as people have their last little bit of summer and enjoy themselves before school comes back full swing into business. The week after, September 14th, which is the Monday before Rosh Hashanah, my guest will be Yossi Klein Halevi, one of the a journalist, a novelist, a deep thinker, a fellow at the Hartman Institute, also a good friend. We'll be talking about the relationships of Israel and the diaspora as we enter a new year. So we hope that you'll join us for that on the 14th at 12:30. And that's it. I want to wish everyone a good week and a good year. Shana Tova u'Metuka. And be sure to check out our website, www.beth-tzedec.org, for all the opportunities that are available to you to engage in sacred community today and through the year ahead. Thanks again, Dan. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.